Welcome. So we so appreciate you sparing your time for this webinar. We know how busy you are. So we'll make sure we have a really high value discussion for you. And what we really aim to do on these videos is to explore the questions that you probably don't have time to think about because you're just so busy. This is your chance to sit back, lift your head and think about some of the bigger topics. So I'm delighted to have two brilliant speakers here, although speakers isn't quite the right word because we have an informal session on these webinars so that we can discuss issues. So we don't have slides. We welcome your questions. Please do participate. So Asad, you may have seen Asad before. Asad has been a CHRO 4 times. He's led large HR teams and also led transformation projects of those teams. He's based in New Jersey. Welcome and thank you, Asad. And we also have Sylvain here, who Sylvain's based in Munich. And Sylvain has spent time on both sides of this particular fence because he's been on the HR side and then also spent considerable time on the leadership side of the fence, most notably working at Crotonville University, heading up leadership development for General Electric. And I had the pleasure of working with him then. So welcome both. So just to position this topic, leadership, I know, is important to all of us. You could say that for us in HR, leadership is one of the topics that really helps us to do a great job or really hinders us if the leadership isn't great. So I know we're all really interested in it. And so much has changed over the last 2.5 years. And leadership has to change, and we need to take control of that process of changing leadership and responding to the changes that have taken place. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is for us to get clarity on how leadership has changed. So Asad, could we start with you? What's your view on that?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Deborah. When I was thinking about leadership is a big subject. But if I put on my CHRO kind of hat and simplify from my perspective, I look at three things that we need to look at from a leadership shift perspective. The first one is employees. So there's a shift in the employee sphere. What is that shift? So first of all, if you think about the traditional employee, doesn't exist anymore. The 9 to 5 kind of employee who left everything at home, their problems, their issues, their family, and their thinking, they left it at home and then came to work and just focused on work kind of thing. And they weren't supposed to kind of think outside of that work thing. So, if you made that probably two human beings or two persons or two personalities showed up at work. That has changed. Now a full human being is coming to work. So if I'm going to work, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, and I'm a part of a community, I'm a part of a country kind of thing. So a full human being is coming to work, and that presents a big change from a leadership perspective, how we engage people, because leadership is about leading people. So now a full human being is coming with all the emotions, feelings, that we all experience. How does leadership respond to it? So there's a shift there. There are many other shifts as far as the employees is concerned, and there's a lot of research around wellness, or the fact that people are not happy with their careers or their jobs kind of thing. So motivation, engagement of those employees is a very important part of being able to lead them. The second thing for me from a leadership perspective is work has changed completely. So, people are coming in and saying, okay, I want to do meaningful work. Why do I want to come to work and what kind of work I want to do. Then they're also saying, we've seen in the pandemic that I can do this work from everywhere, wherever. So what we used to think the office was, it's not no longer true that we have to go to one place to do the work. You can do work in many different places. So organizations have to kind of respond to it and say, how do I get the work done? If people aren't, all the people aren't in one place, how do I get work done? Structures have changed, relationships have changed, how people collaborate has changed. So a lot of things with regard to the work has changed. And if that has changed, then obviously leadership has to change as well. So, you can no longer have 5-day meetings, for example, right? So, how do you kind of structure your leadership? How do you lead people? Is impacted by the changes or the shift that we've seen as far as work is concerned. And then the third piece from me is really the culture, which kind of, is impacted by the first two, which is the employee and the work. But the culture is impacted both by what's happening inside and outside the company. So a lot of companies, for example, are focused on ESG, the environment, the social impact, the governance impact. Those are all things that are impacting the culture. And as a leader, I think your foremost responsibility is to create a culture or an environment where people can succeed. So those three elements have had massive shifts,
Mm.
and that has led to a change in leadership from my perspective, and we have to respond to that.
That's a great summary, Asad. Thank you. Sylvain, what's your perspective on how leadership has changed?
And Debbie, I wanted to go back 1 second to what you said at the beginning around how we in HR are dependent on our leader. And at GE, we used to say, as a CEO, you get the HR leader that you deserve, which I think goes a little bit in that direction. When you have a CEO, a C-level team that really sees HR as part of the key driver of productivity, of engagement, of transformation, then you can really respond that way. Of course, it depends on our own capability and how we work with them and coach them and challenge them. But there is that reciprocity I like you mentioned at the beginning. So yes, building on what Asad said, which I think is really nicely showing how the context is changing in which leadership takes place. And leadership is always a response to the context. So we really need to understand what's happening there. I'm doing a research project right now where we interview CEO of large public and family-driven business to understand what is changing for them. What have you been through during the pandemic, very personally, as a human being, as a leader, and your company, and what is changing? And we found a few things. Number one, we found that people say, I'm missing the pulse of the organization. I used to walk around, I used to do business trip, I used to speak with people, have informal chat, formal meeting, and I used to get a sense, not something I can measure, but something I know in my intuition, my guts. And I said, but how does it look like you lose that sense? And one of them said, well, for example, I received yesterday a resignation from a leader that I was really not expected. And in the past, I would have sensed that coming. I could have reacted before. Now, when it's on my desk, it's too late. So they are losing the pulse, the vibes, if you want, of the place, because we are not there anymore all together all the time. The other thing that I heard is the topic of presence. So how can I be present with my team when I cannot be physically present? I'm distant from you. And so how can I show executive presence? How can I connect with you personally? Things like, how do I build empathy via a platform like we have now? And I get a sense for people, for their emotion, for where they stand, and I can engage them. As Asad said, and I saw that in the chat, somebody saying, bring your whole self to work. How can I capture that whole self if we are not together in a room? Mm-hmm. And then the third one, which is big part of the discussion right now, is productivity. Mm-hmm. And I just saw a statistic this morning that said that 80% of employees worldwide believe that their productivity has either remained the same or increased since the start of Corona, 87. and only 12% of leaders feel that they are confident about the level of productivity of their team. And I found that staggering, from 87 to 12. So most people say, look, I've never been as busy as I am. And most leaders say, I've never had such a challenge to know what my people do. And I think that's such a gap we as HR need to help reduce. Otherwise, we will continue to see people disengaged and leaving.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So actually, we've got two factors that have just come out to me from what each of you have been saying. And one is the need to look at the whole person, because we all take our whole self to work. And of course, the leader is a whole self as well. And we must remember that. They have a tough time. You're saying, you know, that guy resigned unexpectedly. So they must have been struggling. And so that requires empathy and the softer side of leadership. And yet there is this other challenge that you mentioned, Sylvain, which is about how do you make sure you're getting the productivity? And we've all heard stories, haven't we, of how different organizations are trying to measure the productivity and, you know, some, whether it's moving the mouse on your computer and things like that. So what do you think are the skills that leaders need to develop in this new world of work?
You want me to go first?
Go ahead.
So I think, you know, I saw a quote yesterday of Albert Einstein that I kind of liked, and it kind of captures how we want to think about leadership. He said that you can't explore the new world with old maps. Right. So I think that's one of the recognitions that leaders have to have in terms of, okay, whatever my leadership was, or whatever I thought my leadership, you know, is, how do I change it to the context that has changed? So, for example, we want to know engagement scores. So we've done that over the last 20 years in HR, engagement surveys, pulse surveys. We kind of find out whether or not people are engaged. So if you look at Microsoft right now, they've thrown away engagement scores. They're looking at, okay, are our employees thriving or not, which is a different thing than engagement, right?
That's
So
a
they
tough
can,
thing to measure, isn't it?
yeah, but they have, you know, they've written about it. They've written articles about it in terms of how they're looking at people and what does thriving mean? Because when the pandemic hit, everyone, all the organizations and employees were in survival mode. Right? So Microsoft thought that, okay, this change is going to be constant, so we cannot really continue to operate in this survival mode. But if we know this change is going to continue, how do we thrive in that, right? So that's what I meant, that, you know, the lens in terms of leadership, some of the measures that we had of how we looked at productivity, how we looked at engagement, how we looked at performance, a lot of things have changed, right? So, for example, some employees are going to come to work and some employees are not going to come to work. So is our bias going to be that, okay, the people who show up, they are better than the people who don't show up?
Yes. It's a new
Right.
kind of bias, isn't it?
Exactly. So if you're, as a leader, you're not challenging your own kind of lens in terms of how you're thinking about this, you're still going to measure things with the old measure stick. You're going to find, okay, you know, probably the wrong answers.
Yeah.
Right. So if you don't change that, kind of get to the new maps to kind of think about the new world, then you're not really going to get to the right answer.
That's a really good analogy, isn't it? The map of the world of work has completely changed, and we've got to just turn our heads around. Sylvain, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, and I like that analogy of the map. In fact, what I see often is leaders that still use their analog understanding of the world of work in a digital setting. And And it's no critic. I mean, we've been thrown out of the office without preparation, without training, without whatever. And so we now have to use the skills that we learn, most of us in a physical environment, to lead in a digital environment. And that's very different. And that's where I think that we really need to help those leaders. Those leaders are at the forefront of the transformation. They are the change agent that will make the transformation a success or not. And with most companies I've been working with, when you ask the leader, it's very split. Some of them do not believe in that new world of work. So now you have change champions who need to drive a change that don't even believe in themselves, and they don't have the skills to drive. That's very complex. If we go back to the topic of productivity, which I think is really central to the discussion and the tension we experience right now, you see that most people, as you said at the start, Debbie, are overwhelmed right now. In fact, I'm so glad we have people joining us, because I know there is so much you have to do waiting for you. And people are really back to back to back to back. There is a higher intensity, and studies have shown that when we were sent home, we had to add a lot of work to orchestrate the digital work. And so we were doing all the same work as face-to-face, plus on the top, all the work to orchestrate the meeting, the connection, etc. So that's why we have so much more to do. I think you mentioned Microsoft, Assad. They've shown that in the last 12 months, the number of instances when you are double booked in your agenda increased by 46%. It used to be only the top leader. Now it's almost everybody who is double booked. And the number of decline for meeting have increased by 84%. So you really see people being overwhelmed with that. And what people need from the leader, back to your question, Debbie, I think it's clarity. I need to know what really matters, what's important. And you see that people that are clear about their priority, they are more engaged, they are happier, and they are more productive. Now, you see lots of people asking for productivity. 81% of employees in a recent survey said we want more clarity, and only 31% say I do get the clarity. So again, another gap in data that shows there is something we can do: train, equip our leader with the right tool, the right skills to understand how do I spend more time clarifying my employee what's important, what's not.
And how clear are leaders at the moment about what's important and what's not? It really feels, doesn't it, like things are still settling down. You can't say this is how it's going to be. This is what we can now plan for. And so, as somebody said in the chat, it's just so important to keep communicating. So even if leaders don't have clarity themselves, they can actually communicate what it is that they're doing to try to get clear. Assad?
Yeah, so I agree. I think the second point I wanted to make, so the first one is new maps for the new world. I think the second thing that is being asked of leaders, which relates to clarity, is that we have to declare who we are as an organization and what we do. You cannot there's a paradox. So you cannot kind of please every employee who's coming in. That's not possible. Kind of thing. But you do have to declare who you are as an organization. So you have to be deliberate, which wasn't the case so much with many organizations before. So for example, culture was a happenstance kind of thing. It happened. How we make decisions, how we act, who we promote, kind of thing. It just happened because one leader believed it like this and one leader believed like that. And you put all of that together, it became how you operated as a company. So, for example, today, some leaders find it very difficult to say that everybody can work from home, right? But they also want people they don't want people to lose people, right? So they have a choice of declaring who we are as an organization and then allow the different kinds of employee to make their choice. I want to work for this organization, or I want to work for this organization. So it's no longer possible that you kind of waver and say, I won't do this, but I want that kind of thing. So as an organization, you have to choose so that you can provide clarity to employees. Okay, I want to, this is where I think I can do my best, or this is not a place that I want to go. So I think that's the second thing, that leadership has to be much more deliberate.
Mm.
And that provides clarity to employees that, okay, then I want to work here or I don't want to work here, kind of thing.
And of course, there are some things that they're not so much what leaders say, they're what leaders do, such as the messages they give about whether or not they want people to work from home and whether or not they trust them to be productive when they work from home. So trust seems to be such an important factor in leadership at the moment.
Absolutely.
Sylvain, what are your thoughts?
So I agree with all that has been said, and I think most of that is not new. It's funny to see all the discussion we have about topic about leadership that in fact we've been pushing for 40, 50 years. Trust, empowerment, outcome focus, culture. I mean, that's not new. You pick any leadership book back from Peter Drucker's time and Warren Bennis and Stephen Covey, it's in it. I think what the crisis is doing, it's accelerating all of that in a really good way. I mean, it had a lot of disaster effects. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, but if we focus narrowly on leadership and HR, and Debbie, we've been speaking about it, but I think the crisis we are going through is a crisis for HR to shine. As much as the financial crisis was a crisis for CFOs to shine, I think it's our time for CHRO and their team to shine, because now we start to realizing, oh, we need to focus on our people. Oh, our people are important. Yeah, I mean, is it really new? No, but we have more focus on it. We have more budget. We have more attention. The board is interested in it. So we have to really surf that wave. And at the same time, where we have to be careful is everything we are discussing should not be perceived as the last HR theme of the month, so to say, because otherwise it will be kind of check the box, we do it. And at some point, I will start refocusing on my inflation challenges, supply chain challenges. I mean, all the challenges that companies have to lead right now. So the more we in HR, we can partner with finance, we can partner with IT, we can partner with communication, those people that will enable us to do a real transformation, the more sustainable it will be.
Yeah, we've got to look at the opportunity as well, haven't we? We've got some great comments coming through here. Tom saying trust is a huge factor both ways. Trust and confidence extends far beyond the legal context in which the term is most commonly used. Sam Kello, welcome. Authenticity is also coming up as another critical competency for leaders next to trust, because you kind of think you can hide behind that screen, and yet actually you can't. And Shaman, thank you for this point. Can't we all agree on a fact that KPIs and end results are the right measures to identify productivity? We've got to get better at that as well, haven't we? Yes, because if somebody's working from home, even for a short time, and they get results, who cares about the hours they do? Because, of course, sometimes you have your best ideas when you're out walking the dog, don't you? Or when you're doing something completely different, and then you bring those home and you put them into work. And Portia, thank you. I think the issue with many company leaders is that they do not know what the KPIs are, and or they're too lazy to actually think about them. So we got different points coming in. I think something I know as well from working with different HR leaders is that your contexts are all very different. So the perspective that you have on how leadership is changing in your organization might be different to other people's. So I'd like to move on to our second topic, which is, once we're clear about what the changes in leadership are that we want to bring into our organization or have more of or less of, how can HR and L&D people approach this? Sylvain, let's start with you.
Yes, and so the first thing I would like to say on that point, Debbie, is first, again, it's not an HR or L&D topic. So it's something where defining the target picture of what we want leadership to be, what we want culture to be, what we want future of work to be, whatever you call that in your organization, might be HR led or HR initiated, but you really need the other key function around the table with you. Otherwise, it's going to be permanently a fight, or you're trying to push something, and I'm not sure it's going to be neither successful nor sustainable over time. So the first thing to say, really that cross-functional view on the transformation, I think is critical. Number two, I would say that even though there is a lot of hype around the future of work, and it might sound sobering, I think most of what we've been doing is still right. I mean, coaching our leader, bringing data to our leader to help them see what's happening in the organization, being an advocate for employees, communicating on a regular basis. I mean, we had that point around communication. Communication is the heartbeat of community. And as we don't see each other, it's even more important virtually. So all those things which were important, we shouldn't forget about them. And as well, with all the focus on people leaving the company, we should not focus that most are staying. And so instead of thinking all the time about the great resignation, let's think about everybody who is staying, which is typically 70-80% of your employee, and love those people and serve those people and develop those people. So trying to get rid a little bit of the hype right now, I would say, Debbie. And then number three, again, I think it's a great opportunity for HR to shine. And so us being, as much as we can, a coach, a thought leader, challenging our leader to really get there, challenging their behavior, challenging how they do, help them develop their skills, make them feel comfortable in that new type of leadership we expect. That's a really good role we can play right now.
It's an interesting point about helping leaders to feel comfortable too, because it's a tough time when you're leading people. Asad, your thoughts on that?
I completely agree with Sylvain in terms of this is the leadership change piece is not just the HR kind of responsibility. Otherwise, you're just pushing a big rock up the hill kind of thing. I think it has to be the entire organization, and it has to start at the top, from my perspective, where the CEO, even the board, and the leadership team kind of think about, okay, what has changed and who are we as leaders, and what is expected of us as an organization, and how do we step up. So I think that's very important in driving this kind of change. The things that I have used in the past that has helped is that, there are three kind of phases as you think about it. The first one is education and making sure people understand it. So a lot of people don't understand all the changes that are happening, and like Sylvain said, some people don't believe that all those changes are the right changes kind of thing. So educating your organization, getting everybody on the same page in terms of what the shifts have been, is very important before you ask them to change, before you ask them to kind of do that. So help people resist change when they're not informed appropriately. So I think if you're driving this change, make sure that you're educating people along the way that, okay, what has changed. The second piece of driving that change is that because there's so much change, pick the 3 or 4 things that really are going to be critical for your organization. You can't solve the whole puzzle, but pick the 3 or 4 pieces that really matter and get traction on it. Okay, because that success in that will then empower the whole organization and bring more confidence in terms of where we're headed as an organization, or how leaders are changing kind of things. It'll allow the HR function and the leadership team to build tools or processes that help the traction kind of thing, instead of trying to solve the whole leadership issue. And once you've had enough progress or critical mass, then you can start thinking about, okay, how do I now move it further and kind of build it in a more appropriate sense. So I think that architecture, I think HR has to kind of think and strategize with the leaders and think about, okay, here's the change and how are we going to drive it. To me, those 3 steps of educating, picking 3-4 things that really we can get really good traction at and learn from, and then saying, okay, here's all the other things that we need to kind of do.
Mm. Yeah, Sylvain, what would you like to add?
So I was thinking of a few things. The first one is, as you think about, as you said, Debbie, the type of leadership you want or the type of way of working you want, I think it's important you define something that makes sense for your company, your industry, your culture, your strategy, your resources. So very specific to who you are. It's very important you have a stand and a point of view on what that new way of work is, but don't try just to do something because it's hype, because it's mentioned in the newspaper, because everybody is talking about it. It has to fit with where you are as a company and where you want to go. And so those kind of discussion are extremely important so that you can do something. It's an investment. You have to convince the board that you're going to do an investment. And like any investment, it's a financial investment. And that investment has to make sense for where the company is going, not just because it sounds good to work that way or that way. And so doing that work up front, I would think is very important. And then the other part around HR, there is so much we can do to support that process. You can think about your recruitment process, your compensation. You can think about the work HRBP do day in, day out. You can think about HR data you can use. I think about the talent process. I mean, there's so many of those tools we have, we can activate to support it. It's a great time to be in HR.
Yeah, it's a really good point about the investment, because probably there will need to be an investment. There'll need to be some leadership development. And so HR or L&D have to make a really strong business case. So they have to link that to the outcomes that the organization needs to deliver. Asad, I think you were going to come in with something there.
Yeah, I think in preparation of this webinar, you and I spoke about an example where, I was in an organization where about maybe 13,000 people were led by 35 leaders. And we wanted to make sure that, we wanted to drive change as far as the environment, the culture was for those 13,000 people. And what we figured out was that these 35 people were really instrumental in a lot of things that happened for those 13,000 people. So, as a goal, what we decided was that these 35 positions should be manned by really, really good leaders, because that's the quickest way to impact employees. And what we did was we did, a lot of development planning for those 35 leaders. We kind of identified what is the benchmark we want for those positions. We had assessment centers, we had development centers, kind of helping those 35 leaders uh, uh, kind of identify where they needed to be better leaders and what impact uh, their leadership was having on the results of the business and the employee engagement as well as turnover. So HR's ability to build a business case, for me to ask to take out 35 of those general managers for 2.5 days to go through a development center or an assessment center, I needed to justify why I needed to take them out and what would be the return that the company would get in terms of its performance, and what would employees get in terms of a better working culture. So HR's ability to kind of, connect with all of that and say, if we do this with leadership, this is what's going to happen with the results, or whether it's productivity or engagement or thriving, whatever that is, our ability to translate that, communicate that effectively, and then execute that is very important in terms of driving this change. So that leadership, being able to identify what impacts what, And therefore, if we change this, how will the results be impacted? Our ability to think that through is going to be very, very important.
Yeah, and I remember when you were telling me about that example, you were having some very straight conversations with the CEO to say, because the CEO had a view on how good those 35 managers were. So actually crystallizing that number of people and saying, well, let's just look at those. And just imagine if the one that you think is the best, imagine you could have the level of performance of all of them up to that level. So we need to articulate this in some quite simple language, I think, to financial people and to CEOs. Sylvain.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's one topic I'm very passionate, Debbie, and I might have a point of view that's not everybody's point of view, but I would like to distinguish in learning, as you mentioned before, between leadership development and learning. And with learning, I mean all kind of skills, capabilities, development. The places where I've seen leadership development work, and obviously I'm biased through my own experience, were places where I was never asked about a return on investment on leadership development. It's like asking a country to do a return on investment on their education, not with the sense of saying, is it effective, efficient, productive? Of course, we need to do that and manage costs, but just about the why. Do we even need leadership development? If somebody asks me that question, then they haven't understood it. It's very hard if you want a leadership development, connect a return on investment analysis to it. It's going to be number that people will really challenge. And so I'm not sure about the value to do that. I think leadership development, the idea to say we keep developing our leader, building their capabilities, supporting them over time, they will get better. And with the amplifying effect they have in the organization that we mentioned before, we are all going to get better, I think is an equation that most people understand without needing to show some numbers or 337% ROI. I'm not sure that really makes sense. So that's one point of view. On learning for skill and capability, again, I think we've never been a better time to be doing that, because you see most companies having a reskilling and upskilling initiative right now. Most people understand that you really need to close the capability gap of your employee. It's required by most employee representative organizations. It's something that most country even needs to work on, because they realize otherwise people will be unemployed. So that's a real field right now where learning can play a big role, where you can use a lot of data to assess the skills that are needed, to assess the kind of learning that can help to close the gap using artificial intelligence, learning experience platform, whatever tools that are there, and then to measure how you close the gap. And here you have very strong data to show to your board. So leadership development, I would argue against a ROI. Efficiency, productivity, yes, but not a ROI. I think on classic learning, reskilling, upskilling, totally we can do that.
I know there'll be some people in the audience who are thinking, I wish I'd worked where you've worked, because we know that there are some HR people working in organizations where the CEO just doesn't get it, doesn't get leadership, doesn't understand the softer side of needing to create trust and empathy with employees. And so they do feel that they've got to do the ROI calculation. And I do think that's so hard. And I really empathize with some of the HR people I talk to, where they are just so struggling with a CEO who doesn't understand leadership, probably isn't actually doing it either. They're not being a good leader. They're not developing good leaders. And of course, usually it's because they've just come from a completely different background. They might have come from the sales background or the finance background, and they feel the pressure of being personally accountable for the numbers. And that makes it harder for them to soften their view. I'm using this word soft. I know that this audience will understand what I mean. To soften that language so that we help leaders understand, those senior leaders who have to sign it off, we help them understand the link between some of the softer aspects of leadership and costs. And of course, we've got this great thing at the moment, haven't we? The Great Resignation. if we can't use that to demonstrate the financial benefit of good leadership, then there will never be a time when we can. What do you think about that, Sylvain?
So I would agree that time is right. I would say if you are in a company where that is not understood, it's a real challenge. So a few things I would do. I would first try to see if we can have some KPI, but those are always distinct KPI. So what can you do? For example, if you do an employee survey, you can see what employee think of their manager or their leader, or you look at engagement level of your leader, or you can look at attrition level of your leader. But we all know that there are so many factors impacting that, and having a leadership development intervention will not be sufficient. So you can use a KPI, but really managing expectation that you might pay off into it. But it's not like input equal output, and that's when it's very difficult. It's much easier on the capability and skills development. So maybe one option is really to focus, if you have to measure everything you do, I would just not do leadership development, to be very honest. Or I would do it at a level that's really kind of prototyping. And you do it with a team, and another team you don't do it, and you look how the team evolve over time. So maybe so small prototype. But really doing a ROI on leadership development, I don't know. I'm still waiting to see how that makes sense. Somebody recently said, what's the ROI of calculating ROI? I think that's a good summary of that point.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Asad, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to what you said earlier, Deborah, which is I don't think that we can here in this webinar kind of say this is the one size that fits all as far as leadership or measuring leadership or the ROI of leadership is concerned, because there's so many different kinds of organization, so many different kinds of different context. Kind of thing, they're blue collar workers, they're white collar workers, and how are you thinking about things is very different. So I think what we're trying to do here from a webinar perspective is putting this thinking in terms of with the audience and within the HR function, in terms of how to think about improving the leadership or changing the leadership based on that shift. I agree with Sylvain that it's kind of difficult to kind of have an ROI on leadership. But when I said in the example, the ROI, it's more about things that really matter to the business. So for example, in that particular example, we had 100% turnover in the blue collar worker in different facilities. So the ROI is you want to reduce the turnover, because you can't really be productive if you are, one person is coming in and one person is going out of the organization, right? So in that particular situation, the ROI is really the turnover that you wanted to come down massively by impacting the leadership. And you kind of understand what behaviors within the leadership are driving the turnover, right? Or conversely, you could kind of think about polling the employees, understanding what is driving their leaving the organization, and those who are staying, right? Why are they staying? So if you understand that, then kind of help the leaders think about, okay, I want to do that. My ROI, when I talk about ROI from a leadership perspective, is the investment in time. So asking the leaders to focus on their development, whether it's learning or their development, is an investment we have to make, because there's they're going to say, if you ask a salesperson, I want you to come out for a day or half a day and do this in terms of development, they're going to say, okay, I'm going to lose sales, I'm going to do this, I have to meet the customer, kind of thing. So as an HR organization, how do you convince the organization to focus on these things has to be related with the results that the business is trying to drive. You may not find a straight line to those things, but you have to make the connection for the business to say, if you want to improve turnover, you have to have better leadership.
And that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I often find myself saying to HR people on programs that we do have to state the obvious. Well, to us, it's obvious. It's obvious to us that if you're nice to people, they won't leave. But actually, with some senior leaders, you need to actually say that. So
Maybe,
yes.
Sorry to stop you here. I just wanted to add some, and that's a great point, Debbie. And I'm wondering if those leaders are nice to their own people, and so maybe not. But just back to what Asad was mentioning, I think it's a great point, and I have seen a recent example of that. So I like this idea of saying, look, we have an issue in that plant. We have 100% whatever number of attrition of employee. And that's what some call the problem-led learning. So you start with a real problem issue, 100%, 85%, whatever. And I saw a comment in the chat around that. Developing business acumen and putting the change proposals through numbers and analytics. That's exactly it. So you find a business issue. And then you go a step back and you do a little bit of analysis, anthropology, you look at people behavior. Maybe it's an issue of supply chain. Maybe it's an issue of the manufacturing line, process, IT, you don't know. And most of the time, it's a collection of issues that leads to that. And then with the business and your colleague of other function, you design an intervention that includes leadership development, but is not limited to it. And then I'm okay to say we have a ROI. So now we should collectively be accountable to go down from 100 to 50. But it's not because of a leadership development intervention. We are going to do other things. And I was speaking recently with a large manufacturing company, and they've built in their manufacturing line learning center across the world, where they do this kind of problem-led learning. And the teams go together in it to solve business problem, issue they have of quality, of cost, of efficiency on the production line. They can use, they have technology to do digital twins, so they can do tests live in the lab around what will happen in the real world. But they talk as well about people behavior, about skills, and then you have a whole intervention that can be connected to a KPI and a request of investment from your CFO. But for that, we as learning leader, we need to go down in the trenches, in the lab with the colleague and solve the issue with them.
So that's a great idea. So you're saying you start with the problem, and I know I've done this actually, maybe even working with you at the time, Sawar, where we started with an issue, which in this case was field service engineers. They're the people who are closest to the customer. So let's learn from them and learn from the customer. Oh, and by the way, while we're doing it, we will impart them with some leadership skills and we'll identify their potential. So that's a great way to approach it. So when we think about creating a sustainable framework for building great leadership, how can HR build it or build some processes and frameworks so that it becomes part of the way businesses operate? And I know that in GE, and I know I can mention this because it's in the public domain, they have this marvelous session C thing where everybody knows that, everybody in the organization knows that senior leaders, middle managers, a lot of people get together to discuss succession planning, potential, and so on. And because it's embedded into the organization, it has real authority. And so it's part of the DNA really of HR and L&D. But how can HR functions get this going? Asad, let's start with you.
I think it's at the lower end, it's very important that if an employee comes in, how we bring an employee in, who we bring in, how we assess them, how we promote them, how we pay them, how we assess them. All of those processes have to be integrated into whatever change we're trying to do. You can't have compensation based on just results when you're trying to have different kinds of leadership behavior. So you don't incentivize or recognize or promote people on the leadership behaviors, and you just pay them on the results that they do. So if you don't have an integrated HR set of processes that embrace this new change as far as leadership is concerned. You're not going to give consistent messages to people in terms of, okay, why should I change? Because the whole organization doesn't recognize it in the processes or in the things that that an employee really sees. Employee really sees who is my leader, how do they behave, how is my performance set up, how am I assessed, how am I paid, how am I grown in the organization. If all those processes together are not talking about what we want from a leadership perspective, then obviously you're not going to have traction, because there's things on paper or things we aspire to, and then there's reality, which is different.
And we've got to reward them for the reality.
Exactly. So that, to be able to do that, you have to kind of start again with the leadership and say, okay, if we are going to put together who's a high potential, what does it mean in this new framework of leadership? Does
And
that
that probably is quite different to how it would have been 3 years ago, the way potential is assessed.
Exactly. So you have a bonus pool. How are you going to spread that bonus pool across people? Who are the people who are going to get paid? Who are the people who are going to get promoted? Right? Based on what?
Based on what? Yeah.
If all those processes and the tools that we have for leaders are not integrated and have one approach, and the right approach that the organization thinks they need from a leadership perspective, then you're going to dilute the message. And therefore, individual leaders are going to kind of say, okay, I want to be able to, this is not my understanding, or this is not how I want to do this. This is how I want to do this, kind of thing. So employee experience is a great measure in terms of, are they feeling that change in leadership or not? And it's down to, at a lower level, for me, making sure that the HR processes that impact the employee life cycle have those measures built in, and we understand how people are going to be paid, how they're going to be assessed, how they are going to be developed in the organization, how they are going to be promoted. All those processes have to say the same thing.
Yeah, actually put that really well, Asad. And it reminds me of the analogy of the map. It's like we've got to give them a different map.
Yeah.
Silva, what are your thoughts on these processes and practices to make sure that we embed a different kind of leadership?
And I assume I don't have more than 2 minutes now, David.
We could talk for another half an hour, I think, but
we
yes.
could. No, so I'm going to be very, very brief. And so I like the point Asad mentioned about employee experience. I think it's particularly valuable if you're in a global role, or let's say a role that's more corporate driven or headquartered, depending on the size of your organization, because it enables you to go very deep in one element of the employee experience. One type of work I did on that with a client was to look at returning mothers. And you could think returning mothers is a very small part of the whole employee experience. It doesn't affect all your employees, it's only a small part. But we knew it was a part connected to lots of emotion for those employees. So a moment that matter in their life with the organization. And as well, a very challenging moment for most mothers. They come back to a place they don't recognize, their role might have changed. So we looked at that, we collected data, and we developed a solution that started, in fact, before they leave, in order to make the return more effective. And that can be done in a very practical way with tools, etc. So that's one. And then the other one, I was thinking, if you are more like an HR business partner, and maybe I know you have a passion for them, and you work with somebody in the business, and that's some point you mentioned, maybe it's nothing new, but I think that idea to have that business acumen, so the less you speak HR to start with, the more trust you will build with your contact. I remember at GE talking with leaders, and I remember one of them saying, "Hey, Sylvain, you don't seem like you are from HR." And I said, "Why?" "Well, you ask so many questions about my business." And I felt good because he was kind of praising me, and I felt bad for my function. We should all be asking first 100 questions to understand what they do, what's the issue, help them solve that, and then they will be open for other ideas we have, not the other way around. So that's the way I think, Debbie, to build trust, so that over time you can bring other topics more intangible, maybe harder to measure.
So that actually takes us full circle, because when we started, we were saying that there is a new map, there's a new world. We have to help leaders to navigate it, and they have to help their teams to navigate it. And so if we're thinking about this new map for how leaders operate, and a new map for how we help them to understand the employee experience, then actually the HR map has to begin with really understanding the business landscape. So that's always our place to start, really, isn't it? Make sure that we understand our organization, our client groups, what drives success, and link everything back to that.